Are you overworked, overwhelmed, and on the verge of burnout? This is the Leaders of Transformation podcast. And on this show, we interview difference makers and world changers who are disrupting for good. I'm your host, Nicole Jansen, and our guest today is Teresa Vozza. Teresa is a leadership expert, a certified executive coach, and a former HR executive with 20 years experience. She is passionate about eradicating burnout for executives. And today we're going to be actually talking about the difference between harmonious hustle and an unhealthy hustle, how to avoid burnout before it happens, and how to overcome it if that is where you're at right now. Teresa, welcome to the Leaders of Transformation. We're excited that you're here today.
Thanks, Nicole. Such a pleasure to be here and to be with you. You have a strong reputation in the industry, so it's a real treat.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Welcome.
And let's do a shout out for Stan Peak and the team at FSQ.
Absolutely.
That's actually how we met. So
that's how we met. Yeah.
They're an awesome group of people, and they've developed for our listeners and viewers, they've developed a cohort of extraordinary coaches, and they're committed to building better leaders and helping businesses to drive profit and performance. So we're going to do a little free plug for them. And if you are interested in learning more about that, you can go to getsuccessfaster.com and tell them Nicole sent you from Leaders of Transformation. But they're an amazing group of people, and they work in the business space, the sports space, as well as marketing and finance. So you get access to a whole group of amazing coaches. And so, which is, as I said, how Teresa and I met, and Teresa is one of those coaches, and so am I. So they're awesome. So, Teresa, let's dive in and let's talk about this idea of burnout. Why does it seem like, even though everybody talks about it, and yoga is of course such a popular thing now, it's like yoga and meditation and gratitude and all these things are wonderful, and yet it doesn't seem to be getting any better?
Such a good question, and I'm with you. I am with you. And there's a few reasons why I think burnout is still prevalent. I think one of them is the definition of burnout is not exact, right? So there's a prevailing theme that emerges, and I think the self-help industry has also, in some ways, exacerbated that, where that burnout is about working long hours, it's about 60-hour work weeks or deadlines and pressures and other stresses. But what they neglect to sometimes talk enough about is that there's other types of burnout that I see a lot in my coaching practice, that is around career stuckness, that is around being bored at work, sometimes underwhelmed. And I'm often hearing too that it just leaves people feeling empty, inefficient, and even dead inside. So I think the missing equation when we talk about burnout is that it occurs when there's a mismatch between people and their jobs. And we often don't look at the mismatch because that requires having to go a little bit deeper and find out, where is that actually occurring? Where are my values not a match for the organizations? So that's one reason. But another reason too is the world of work has changed. I mean, ever since the pandemic, the return to office has not been smooth. And so what we're seeing and what I'm hearing is that jobs have not been backfilled, and many bosses still prefer having employees in the office. And with the recessionary pressures that we find ourselves in, the economic climate is really uncertain. And so with that uncertainty comes this hesitation around quitting jobs or leaving. So it's not as simple as just going on a vacation or going to yoga or meditating. It's really about getting to the root of the disconnect between your job and your health. And that includes physical, mental, and emotional.
It's so true, because when you love what you do, I know that for myself, like which I do love what I'm doing. But when I love what I'm doing, I'm more motivated. I have more energy towards it. People will say, oh, I'm exhausted. And then, their friend calls and says, hey, do you want to go golfing today? Or do you want to go to shopping, depending on what you're, or go to the spa? And it's like, oh, I'm right there, and they're
Mm-hmm.
up off the couch and they're excited about it. And so there is that, like you said, there's that mismatch that's happening in the workplace where people are bored. They're actually, and you used a word there, underwhelmed. We often talk about overwhelm, but a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people are actually underwhelmed because they're not stimulated even enough
Mm-hmm.
at
Yeah.
work. And it's like, oh my gosh, how many times have we heard that, right? I mean, it's like
Yeah.
wake up
Yeah.
in the morning, oh, I gotta go to work. And that
Yeah.
is not a way to live your life. So I
No.
I imagine you've also experienced this yourself if it's something that you're
Oh,
passionate
yeah.
about. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I'm such a believer, Nicole, and I think you are too, that we can't speak from a pulpit if we haven't that experience,
Yeah.
right? And so when it comes to burnout, I realized through my own experience what didn't work. And so for me, interestingly enough, both cases of burnout, and I had two very different episodes, but they both occurred when I was at the peak of my corporate career. And it was when I was getting promoted. So both times when I became a director of HR for an organization, that was my first episode. And the second time was when I became a VP. Again, it happened. And what I learned about myself in the process of burnout is that I'm a self described hyper overachiever. And I know we hear a lot about that these days. But what we don't hear a lot about is the anxiety that comes with that. And I had a lot of high anxiety. Anxiety has been a part of my story. So a lot of it was driven not necessarily even from the work, but what I often say to my clients, like 100 forms of self-validation, right? So wanting to be liked, wanting to impress other people. I would go out of my way to be seen as the go-to person, this whole concept of being seen as special. And that resulted in me just overworking and trying too hard. And it led me to multiple trips to the emergency. I'm not embarrassed to say now that's part of my story, but at the time it felt very, very dramatic because I thought I was having a heart attack when in fact what I was having was extreme anxiety attacks. And so through that experience, I learned so much of what led me to self-destruct and to burnout was really more about how I thought about myself and how I thought about my leadership and for me and for my story, how I related to authority figures was a big piece. So when someone told me or would tell me, and they did many times, you just need to say no more, or you can't please everyone. I already knew that. I knew that intellectually, but I didn't know that emotionally. And so this is why I think boundaries or setting limits sometimes fails leaders because we can't assert a boundary without first understanding why it is that we do what we do and what we actually wish to take a stand on in our life. So we can provide scripts and templates, but honestly, if you had told me that like 8 years ago, I would not have used those scripts or templates because I didn't feel safe. And psychological safety, which I know is another very popular term, and I almost prefer to call it emotional safety, is a precursor. Like it needs to be there first before boundaries can actually take hold and be effective. And that's hard work. That's hard work that sometimes we don't want to do because it forces us to face ourselves.
Well, and so when you talk about psychological safety or emotional safety, that's a culture too. And so
Mm-hmm.
you can choose to show up a certain way, but if the organization is
Yeah.
not set up for that, it creates another disconnect there. Before we get
Yeah.
into how to set boundaries
Mm-hmm.
and all of that, I want to kind of go back to this idea of burnout. Did you know that you were burned out?
No, I did
See,
not.
that's what I think a lot of people don't know that they're burned out. They just think
Yeah.
they need a vacation. Or
Yeah.
they just think they need even a job change. And
Yeah.
it might be that you need a job change or whatever, or they get irritable with their family and that kind of thing. I mean, look, for me, I know because I've been burned out actually 3 times.
Yeah.
And it was all in a 5-year period of time, and just overworking, pushing, feeling the futility of it, of what I was trying to do to, and so I was like, I didn't even want to talk to anybody and get out of bed. That was my experience. But can you talk about what burnout looks like? So there may be some people who are listening who might actually not even know that they're in it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you asked that question, because at the time I didn't know what it looked like. And for many of your listeners, who I imagine are leaders of organizations and, thriving entrepreneurs and individuals who know how to work hard and know how to go above and beyond. And so part of it for me, just to give some context before I get into what it actually looks like, is that I was role modeled an approach to career that involved having to work long hours, having to prove your worth. And so there was a disconnect between the way I worked, which was to go above and beyond, and how it affected my mental and emotional health. I assumed it was just what hard workers do. So my belief system was skewed in a direction that wasn't helpful. And how it shows up, it shows up in so many ways, but I think the three probably most commonly referred to symptoms that I see both in my practice, and I don't know if this is the same for you, Nicole, is exhaustion is usually on top of the list. There's just not just physical exhaustion, although that is one of them, but there's mental exhaustion. So that looks like when we hear, I'm drained, or I just don't have anything left to give, or I just want to flake out with Netflix for the next 2 or 3 hours. So it's this sense of depletion, which I call a mental and emotional drain. So that would be one. So physical, mental, emotional exhaustion. I think the other is also inefficiency, or feeling like you're not really moving the needle. So there's this, I know for myself, I worked for a global organization. There was multiple layers of approvals and bureaucracy that was included. And that level of internal politics, which is what I think many of us would refer it to, can be also really draining, because you're always feeling like you're pushing things uphill but getting nowhere. So that inefficiency, whether it be a process inefficiency or a relationship, like a coworker relationship where nothing gets done, we don't move the needle further, can also result in this type of feelings of ineffectiveness. And what I hear a lot is, I don't feel of value. I don't feel like I'm making an impact here. And a lot of that is born from the bureaucracy or the internal politics that sometimes can exist in organizations. And I think the third, if I'd had to really bring it down to 3 qualities, is also just this feeling of being trapped. So the sentiment where you feel as though you want to make a change, but you don't even know how, or the belief system that things will not get any better. And I call that cynicism. So this prevailing belief that either, oh, this is just the way it is, this is what leadership is, this is the price of entry, which is something that I believed that this was the price of being a corporate executive. Or it's this, nothing will ever change. Even if I go to another organization, nothing will change. So this real cynical point of view starts to inhabit yourself, and it shows up in the body too. I see that a lot, even from a client perspective, where we're hunched and we're downcast and we just don't feel alive or vital. So I think those would be the 3 that I see a lot of in my practice.
Yeah, I can relate to all 3 of those at some point, and I think a lot of other people can as well, because and that last one's really interesting because it's kind of a little elusive. Like, you don't actually know, you wouldn't normally attribute it to burnout.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's really, really good. Let's talk about setting boundaries and how to say no, and then we'll kind of work out, even the support that's needed around that, and how to get the support you need when you need it.
Yeah. So I think boundaries are effective. I want to make that very clear. I think that setting limits, knowing your edges around how much you will tolerate. I know in the trauma space, of which I spent some time, we talk a lot about your window of tolerance, which is not a term that I quoted. It's from one of the giants, I think, in that space. But knowing how much you can hold is absolutely essential to having a life and a career that is thriving and feels good. I think where we go wrong with boundaries is, as I mentioned, I think before, without understanding what you believe about yourself, about the world of work, about leadership, without understanding where your views, your worldviews, your work views come from, boundaries will just feel flat or ineffective, because then it becomes just a script or a templated, here, let's role play and practice setting a boundary, which again, that has a place, but it comes after. It comes after first understanding, what do you value the most in the workplace? What do you value most in your personal life? What is most important to you? And then from that place, you can carve out what are those limits or those edges or those boundaries that we need to practice in order for you to have more of that joy and that rejuvenation in your career and in your personal life. So boundaries are absolutely effective. The same goes for saying no, which is in essence a type of boundary. I think we do executives and even entrepreneurs a disservice when we say that it's as simple as saying no. I don't, especially in the world of privilege, I think that, tell a mom with 3 kids who has to make rent every week to just say no when she is putting food on the table for her children, right? So I think that's a very privileged statement. And while I'm making an assumption that many of your listeners may come from that privilege, I think it's not a long-term strategy to simply say, we just need to say no, and here's all the different ways in which you can say it. What I do think is more effective, and I take a rather bold stance on this, is to first understand how you can best meet the needs of your organization, of yourself, and if you're a woman of faith, of your God or higher power, and from that vantage point, be able to very confidently say no to things that go against your integrity or are not in alignment with your values. That'll feel a lot easier because it comes from a deeper place. Does that make sense to you?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'd love an example so that we can kind of visualize what that might look like.
Yeah.
Maybe from your example or somebody else.
A perfect example could be, I remember, I'll give one from my own life. There was a time when I was in the executive role where we were working on, not a time, there were many times when we worked on mergers and acquisitions. And anyone that's gone through a merger or acquisition knows that it is a long due diligence process that requires a lot of back and forth, a lot of legal, a lot of regulatory, a lot of compliance related meetings and checks and so on. So I recall a time when we were asked to come to work on the weekend, and we were asked to work Saturday and Sunday. And there was a very full-on, all hands on deck approach to being able to push it over the finish line. And I always take Sundays off. Sundays are my rest day. Sundays are my time with family. That is a very near and dear value of mine. And what I did, and I'll provide this as an example for your listeners, is I said, hey, look, like Sundays are a really special day for me and my family. Therefore, let's talk about what we need to get done this weekend, and I will ensure I work with you to get my part complete by Saturday. And if I don't, you can count on it Monday morning. And I said that from a position of strength, not from a position of asking for permission. Because I think when we approach these types of conversations from is it okay if I don't come in on Sunday? We're positioning ourselves from a place of self-doubt or a lack of conviction. But instead, when we approach it from a statement of value, Sundays are important to me and my family. Let's talk about what needs to get done so that I can bring it to you by Saturday, if not first thing Monday morning. How does that sound? And at that time, I remember my boss was like, no problem. Thanks for letting me know. But that's because I felt convicted by a value that this is a special day for me, and I am non-negotiable about that day.
Yeah, that actually brings back like what you were saying earlier about this idea of the values versus, and knowing your values versus having it be a script. It's kind of like what I thought of was, owning it. That you own it, that you literally, you're saying, I'm taking that stand. Like you said, I'm very strong on certain, things. It's like owning it, and then you're very congruent with it when you're communicating it to your boss or whoever. And what I love about that too is that in that example, it's not saying, no, I'm not going to get done what needs to get done. You're saying basically, yes, and so we can learn to say no. And there's a yes, and okay, I hear that all of these things need to get done on the weekend and we want to get it over the line. And I'm going to get it done. I'm just not going to do it on Sunday. And I think that goes a long way, because there's a lot of times people will say, I've heard this, where people are like, well, it's not my job. I'm not going to do that. That's too far.
Yes.
They push the line, and that is too far, and I'm going to have to say no.
Yeah.
And that doesn't usually go very well when people do that. And then it creates this friction within that relationship, and maybe even your potential to continue to be promoted and grow, when you put all these, and you're known as that person who's not going to step up when it's needed. So I think that's really a great example.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought that up, Nicole, because it's true. There's a difference between rigidity and flexibility. And I'm a big believer that, again, in an effort to be very balanced in this approach around saying no and boundaries in executive spaces, especially, it's not a matter of just having a hard and fast no. It is a yes and conversation. And there are times when working late is the right thing to do, or when a meeting that has you traveling is the right thing to do. So it's really about understanding, if you are going to make a trade-off, what is it? And I always look at it like money in the bank, if you will. So it's, if there's been more times than not where I am counted on by my team to deliver, I have some grace there to be malleable with different boundaries, even if that's a hard no. But in most cases, that yes and agile, nimble approach has taken me much farther in my career than it would if I had said, no, that won't work for me. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
So talk about harmonious hustle, and this is your term that you use, versus unhealthy hustle.
Yeah. I'll say that the biggest difference between the two, and then I'll get into what they both mean based on my definition, is that it's the emotional fuel, if you will, the emotional energy is what drives the actions behind, hustling in a negative way, or working hard in a way that's sustainable. So let me explain. When I think about a harmonious hustle, it's sustainable, meaning that it feels good. So if it doesn't feel good, and if the reason for why you're working a few extra hours or, traveling for work doesn't feel good to you anymore, where you don't feel aligned with the reasons for why you're doing it, and it starts to feel like a drain, then quite likely you are in a more of a toxic hustle culture. So for example, an unharmonious hustle or a harmful hustle is when you feel like stress runs the show, when we constantly feel behind or pressured, stressed. And a big one for me is when I feel like I can't move the needle. I just keep going, but there's no traction behind my action. And especially when it feels heavy. And for me, heaviness shows up in my body, and it shows up as a disconnect in between my mind and my body. I can't read the signals very well. And when there's a franticness or a hurry behind the actions, that to me just smacks of like an unhealthy, more toxic form of hustle. When we speak about harmony, or, to make it even simpler, a healthier side of hustle, this is when we're talking about the kind of hustle that is fueled by an emotion of purpose, of meaningfulness, of a direction, of focused energy, of what you're working towards. It's when it feels good and you like your reasons why. So, for example, as a newer business owner, a few years ago when I started, there were periods of intense hard work. And I was invigorated because I was working towards something. You mentioned at the start of our call, because you love what you do. I love what I do. I love coaching women. I love being in front of executives. I love speaking. I love being on podcasts. So even though I have to prepare, just like I had to prepare for this podcast, and that takes a chunk of time, the emotional fuel behind it feels really good. It matches with my why for being here. So when it matches with my why in my career, then we're in a more harmonious hustle or hard work that actually moves you forward and actually has you building something, rather than just working the 9 to 5, if you will, but feeling like you're going nowhere.
This is another reason why it is so important for us to know our purpose.
Yeah.
And why we're here, because, not only will we enjoy what we're doing, we're going to be more effective in what we're doing, and we're going to minimize that potential for burnout. Sure. Can it happen? Mm-hmm. I mean, I've been in positions where I absolutely love what I'm doing, and then it just gets to that overrun. I seem to have that, I seem to be a little bit of an extremist, where it's like just reminding myself of that line, and that changes. And maybe you want to speak to that. It changes with age. And this isn't about I'm getting old conversation. Yeah. It does change with age. What I was able to do at 20 is different than what I'm able to do at 50. And it's not because of, it's just different. It's different. And there's different responsibilities, and there's different things going on as well. Yeah. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, well, what I'll say to that is, one, I can certainly relate. I'm 48, and I have two, I call them tweenagers. And again, probably not my term. And, I'm at a stage in my career and in my life where, social dynamics play a larger role in how they grow up. And so not only do I not have the luxury, I don't desire a lifestyle where I work so much that I'm not present to have those critical conversations at this stage of my children's development. Nor does my body really align with that anymore either. So one of the things that happens, I find, and I'll say this very quickly, is that as I went through my own personal journey of recovering from burnout and understanding what my values are and my why and why I was here, I also got much more in touch with my mind body. So I know what it feels like actually feels like in my body when I go too far. And I still can, because entrepreneurial burnout is just as real as executive burnout. And so now what's different is I have the thermometer I know when I veered too far, and I know how to kind of come back. Whereas I didn't have that before, but my body will now tell me much more than it would have in the past. And so there's a few things there. It's ages and stages, as my mother-in-law likes to call it, in where, burnout and working all those crazy hours just doesn't align with your values anymore. And it's also the mind-body integration, where your mind and your body now tells you more clearly, at least for those of us who've done that inner work, that, hey, we're tipping a little bit over to the other side, and our tank is starting to get empty.
So where do people find these tools that they need to be able to avoid burnout? And if they are in burnout, how to, kind of reel it back in and get the recovery that you're talking about?
Yeah. So a couple things. So I would say that for any of your listeners who feel like they may be on the more toxic side of hustle, or feeling overworked or burnt out, it first starts with awareness. Be aware that you're in a cycle, and in a cycle that is particularly unhelpful or helpful, depending on where you are. And if you feel rewarded by the hustle, then great. But that still doesn't mean that you don't watch out for it. Like in your case, we can still love what we do and feel burnt out. So that's an important point. And then secondly, I would say find out what's really important to you. So are your actions in alignment with what is most important to you? And are you treating self-care as how I think it should be defined as a process of asking yourself, what do I need most in this moment right now? Then once you understand what your needs and wants are, you can start to define actions that match that. And I would also ask anyone that is interested in this topic to really challenge this whole mentality around work hard now and then enjoy yourself later. I grew up with that mentality. I get it. I certainly get it. But that mentality kind of forgoes your ability to care for yourself in the moment. Again, self-care is a process. It's not something that we do, an action that we take, like I'm going to go on vacation, I'm going to recover from burnout. No, it's not that. It's a process of asking yourself on a regular basis. So if your viewers are interested in learning more about, well, what do I do if I find myself in this, toxic side of hustle and I want to move over to a more harmonious side, I do offer a 3-part micro course that will be available for all leaders through this podcast, called The Hustle Paradox, and how leaders really banish burnout. And in this 3-part micro course, you will get a hustle culture audit. So an audit that shows you, am I in the harmful or the harmonious side of hustle, which you can take for yourself, and then how to actually move towards more of what you want. And you'll also be given a really great set of questions that you can reflect on with respect to, how can I use the wisdom of what I know about myself to see if there's a values mismatch between my current employer and what I want to be doing. And there's a couple other things there too, like tools and templates with concrete action steps that anyone that's listening can take to start to move over to that more renewing side of hard work, which has you feeling motivated and inspired.
I love that. And when you talk about awareness being the first step, any transformation happens with awareness to start with. And then there's a choice. What are we going to do with that information that we just discovered? And then there is the follow through on that. And I heard that in your course, that all 3 of those things are incorporated into that. And I think that is great, because it's easy to say, well, I should know. I mean, I know leaders tell me that all the time. I should know this. I should know how to do this. I shouldn't have to ask for help. And it's like, why do you think that you should know everything? Like, where does that come from? That's a belief system that was learned. That's a learned belief. Because ultimately we don't know. Just because you're, the CEO of a company doesn't mean that you know how to handle burnout. And if you don't know, and if you don't get that information, here's another side of it, is that you're not going to be able to help your people. You're not going to be able
Mhm.
to have see the telltale signs of your team,
Yeah.
because we haven't even talked about that.
Mm.
This idea of
Yeah.
leaders recognizing burnout in others and
Yeah.
saying, you need to take a break. It's like
Yeah.
you, I'm sure, do with your clients. Well, obviously, they may come to you for that reason, but I know sometimes clients don't necessarily come to me because they want to overcome burnout. And yet
Mhm.
sometimes I'm listening to them and I'm like, okay, you know what? You need to take a break. Let's stop for a moment
Yeah.
and reflect and create some healthy habits. I call it that,
Yeah.
like, winning strategy. When you do these things, life
Mm.
works on a daily
Mm.
basis. And when you don't do these things, life, like you said, a process, it starts to not work. Right.
Yeah.
And maybe it's subtle. Maybe the first few days, it's not a big deal. And then
Yeah.
gradually, all of a sudden, it starts to really make an impact on your
Mm.
life and on your wellness. So there's recognizing it for yourself is what I'm hearing you say. And it's
Mhm.
also, as a leader, man,
Mhm.
maybe you're not dealing with this, but you need to know how to avoid your leaders becoming. I think about you in the example of being promoted. They valued you
Mhm.
enough to promote you, and yet they didn't see the telltale signs. It's not that it's their responsibility or it's entirely your responsibility. I think it's a joint responsibility, to make
Yeah.
sure that we are taking care of our people as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing I'll say too is that in both my examples, they didn't know because I was wearing a very good mask because that was something I was really good at. I compartmentalized my work and my personal life. So when I showed up at work, I was one Teresa. And when I was at home, I was another. But guess who got the short end of the stick? My home life. So that's the other thing I think that's really important for leaders to know is that you may have people in your midst who are quietly, surreptitiously behind the scenes struggling and who could eventually go off on leave or never do because they're that type, which is what I was. I never went on leave because God forbid that I actually take that time for myself. But then that shows up in your performance later, or it shows up in your body. And in my case, it showed up very predominantly in my body. So it's silent. Burnout can also be very silent. So leaders need to be really careful that they're not ignoring the signs or the prevailing attitudes that eventually come out in an engagement survey that there is a toxic, overworking culture in their midst.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just, as we wrap up here,
Yeah.
thinking of like those telltale signs. You mentioned body, right? So
Mm.
if people are having health issues,
Mm-hmm.
if they're having obviously emotional issues, but they may be able to button that up. Are there any other telltale signs that we can look for in our people?
Yeah, I would say negativity.
Okay.
So we talked a little bit about cynicism, but I think when we start to see kind of that extreme negativity, even bouts of irritation or anger that start to increase as time moves on, that's a signal that their inner resources might be becoming depleted. So that would be another. And I think another sign is this tendency like to receive emails from individuals at all hours of the night. So if we are noticing again as a leadership responsibility that either we are sending emails at all hours of the night or our direct reports are sending emails at all hours of the night or on weekends, that's again another signal that that thermometer, that psychological safety, mental safety thermometer on your team is veering towards an unhealthy work culture. So start looking for those little signs, which are much easier to see than some of the more silent emotional symptoms that we talked about. But those few things could really, really provide more insight as well, especially to a leader.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think if a leader doesn't take care of themselves, they're also not going to see those signs. So it's a full cycle
Yeah.
because you're so in survival mode that you won't recognize what's going on around you, and or you would just assume that this is the way it is. So
Mhm.
so important. Teresa,
Mhm.
thank you so much for sharing this today. And I know that a lot of times people like to hear, how do I do more? And how do I accomplish more? Oftentimes, the way to accomplish more is actually to do less. How do you achieve more with less effort? Well, you get yourself aligned, like you're talking about. You know your values. You align yourself with your values. You take care of yourself. All the things that you're talking about. So this is really, really awesome. So we're going to have all these links in the show notes. Thank you for being here, Teresa, and sharing with us, and thank you to our listeners also for being here. And that Harmonious Hustle micro course for leaders is available to you. It's a free gift from Teresa. Take advantage of it. Leaders of transformation take action. And I say that almost every single time, but here's the thing, is sometimes those actions are not the kind of actions you're thinking that I'm referring to. It's not the, how do I do more? And I've got to take more action in my business. Well, yes, that may be the case. That action, that best next action might be taking care of you, so that the best version of you can show up in the workplace, in your personal life, in your life in general, in your relationships. So I encourage you to take advantage of the tools that Teresa has here to make sure that you are on the right side of burnout, in the sense of you're avoiding it, and you've got boundaries in place to keep it healthy, keep yourself healthy, and also to recognize another, so that you can help your people to stay healthy, and you can all accomplish a whole lot more and have a whole lot more fun and fulfillment in the process. So we'll make sure all of those links, and so that you have connection to Teresa as well, will be in our show notes. You can go to leadersoftransformation.com and find this episode. And thanks for being here. We appreciate you. We look forward to seeing you next week on another episode of the Leaders of Transformation.